One of the things being a venture capitalist starting in 1999 is that you discover there's a quite fine line between genius and insanity. And it's probably even more the case in open source software, where the fundamental premise is that the software doesn't cost anything to get started with it. That played out in the 1990s, late 90s, in what I would describe as an open source gold rush. The term was coined in 98, before people called it free software. Red Hat went public in 1999. We were all really excited back then, and the theory was, well, Red Hat's just the beginning of something huge. And the venture industry, we went back and looked at this, back over 40, quote, open source companies, many of them as just ideas and slides. Red Hat achieved a peak market cap of over $25 billion. VA Linux, which is another venture-backed company, was over $8 billion market cap. And by 2002, and by the way, we had a couple in that 40. I will claim credit for 2 that didn't make it. Open source was a dirty word, and you couldn't even think about raising money for an open source business plan. And those that did were sort of ashamed of it, and it was sort of the dot-com effect, where you wanted to run away from the fact that you'd even gotten near one of them. Red Hat had collapsed over 1 to 1/20th the prior market cap, but it turns out it had a business. And as we've seen now lately, it's come up nicely and built a much more substantial business. But that process of early failure forced us to say, well, if we really believe, should our convictions be shaken about open source, or is there something deeper at work that we can identify as a framework to invest? And pulled back in the course of really, these are our mistakes that taught us these lessons. First and foremost, if you're going to back an open source company, the market has to be of significant size. So going after open source for a developer tool doesn't make a lot of sense. The math has to work. Secondly, and I think this is probably the most humbling thing for a venture capitalist, and something we've had to really internalize, is that critical mass, as defined as the community's declared a victor, has to occur before we invest. And in almost every case, and I would argue every case if you really look at the data, when venture capital went in prior to critical mass, the enabling powers of venture led to a bunch of bad behaviors, not unlike a spoiled kid, that destroyed the opportunity for open source. And it is really humbling when you go back to the Linux cares, the Covalent, SendMail. There's a long list of venture-backed companies that might have been successful if they didn't get what I would argue is doped up on venture capital before it made sense. Thirdly, the companies that have a chance, we've discovered, can't just be any product. They have to be products that go into production that require a support offering. And that's especially true for enterprise-grade open source. And it creates, as you'll see in Mark's case, the oxygen supply for a very interesting business model, where the value equation shifted in the customer's favor, but you can still build a profitable business. An example of I mentioned SendMail. If you guys were familiar with SendMail, it's sort of the industry standard gateway for email. All attempts to make that into an interesting business, or Apache for that matter, have failed because the products are really buttoned down. They don't migrate that much, and they don't require the kind of support that say, an application server does. And then finally and fourthly, there needs to be, in our view, a new frontier of adoption. A lot of companies today are trying to save their businesses by saying, well, let's just make it open source. And all of a sudden, we're going to get lots of uptake, and developers will love us, and we'll have this free distribution. But it's really not where it's succeeded in the past. It's typically around new data center build-outs, new application architectures, and that degree of newness is really central to, and I think this is true for most startups, you're creating a new experience, a new form of adoption, which allows the products to get into market.